Okay, well, I think we're at the top of the hour and ready to go. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Ciancimino. I'm the Director of Regional Development for National Review Institute. I'm based out of Milwaukee, actually just over the Wisconsin border. For those of you that are joining us in Illinois, I assume you have some very nice weather, just like I'm having here today, so let's enjoy it while it lasts. For those of you that are not familiar with National Review Institute, we are the nonprofit parent organization of National Review Magazine. As a nonprofit journalistic think tank, NRI advances the principles championed by our founder, William F. Buckley Jr., and complements the mission of National Review Magazine, including by supporting and promoting NR's top talent. One of the ways that we connect NR writers and readers is through regional partnership events like the one that we're doing today. These events serve two valuable purposes for us. One is to amplify the work of NR writers beyond the magazine and strengthening the overall conservative movement by supporting the many allied state-based organizations across the country. We're pleased to partner with one of those great organizations today in the Illinois Policy Institute, an organization we've partnered with many times. Unfortunately, it's virtually today, but I think very soon we'll be back to doing this in person. To tell you a little bit more about IPI, for those of you that are not familiar, I'd like to turn over to Melanie Krakauer. Melanie.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Melanie from Illinois Policy Institute's communication team. I wanted to thank everyone for coming today and thank the National Review Institute for being such great partners. We're really looking forward to this event. Mailee Smith is our Director of Labor Research Policy. You will hear more about her. We have been covering this issue in great detail over the last month as we've seen what's happened with Chicago Teachers Union, Chicago Public Schools, and teachers unions around the state of Illinois. Labor is one of the many policy issues we focus on in addition to budget and tax, economics, and more. So thank you guys all for coming, and thank you, National Review.
Thanks, Melanie. You can learn more about IPI at illinoispolicy.org. And for a full listing of our events at National Review Institute, we are at nrinstitute.org and click on the events tab. So like I said, we partnered with IPI many times. I'm looking forward to today's topic on the topic of teachers unions, both in Illinois and beyond. As a father of two school-aged children myself, it's a topic near and dear to my heart. I've definitely seen the effects of teachers unions power at the local level here in my district over the last several months. Discussing the issue today is NRI Senior Fellow Jay Nordlinger and Mailee Smith, Director of Labor Policy at IPI. A quick background on both of them. Jay is a senior editor of National Review and writes about a variety of subjects, including politics, foreign affairs, and the arts. He's a music critic at the new Criterion and is the host of two podcasts, Q&A and Music for a While. Mailee Smith is at the Illinois Policy Institute as staff attorney and director of labor policy. In this role, she focuses on labor relations with their impact on Illinois taxpayers. Prior to joining IPI, she worked in Washington, D.C. at a nonprofit where she drafted legislation and served as the organization's primary litigation attorney. Jay, I'm going to turn this over to you. For those of you that are joining us on the call, there is going to be some time reserved at the end for Q&A. You can use the chat function, type in your questions, and hopefully we will get to them all at the end. Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris and Melanie. Mailee, good to meet you. I'm so glad you said your name to me this morning, first thing on the phone. It's such an unusual looking name and spelled name to go with Smith, which we all know. So I'm nosy about names, so tell me about your first name.
My first name is actually Hawaiian, and my parents added an E to the end. There's no special story to it. They just really liked it. And then I married into the Smith. So
does Miley have a meaning?
It is a leaf, I believe.
All right.
They use for the leis. So yeah, I've actually never been to Hawaii, so it's definitely something I need to do sometime.
Feel the same. And did you grow up in Illinois or elsewhere?
I did. I grew up in Illinois, right in the middle of Illinois, the Peoria area. I spent a little bit of time in law school and after law school living in other states and places. but I returned to Central Illinois about 10 years ago and have been here since then.
So Miley, I take it you have free market views, and I wonder how you came to them. I always like to ask people, especially at the beginning, were you born with these views? Did you acquire them along the way?
I would say that I acquired them along the way. It wasn't something that we necessarily discussed in our household while I was growing up. It was really more a matter of fairness to me. I grew up in, well, what I would say is probably the wrong side of the tracks in the town that I grew up in. And while my parents were fine, we were not rich by any means. And the school that I attended growing up was, most of the students were below poverty level. So I grew up seeing poverty and the unfairness of it. And I think that was the shaping of my opinions and my beliefs in how our system should work. I did grow up in the Peoria area. So Caterpillar is here. So in terms of union issues, that was very much something that shaped my growing up, watching what was happening between Caterpillar and UAW, and the arguments that were made for and against different things were definitely part of what shaped what I think and what I perceived in the world as being fair or not fair.
Mm. Well, Miley, I was just thinking today, I'm from a long line of teachers, grandparents, great uncles, great aunts, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. I'm just about the only one who's not. And as I understand it, in olden times, teachers were almost like missionaries. That you took almost a vow of poverty. Often you ate a meal at the home of friendly parents, that sort of thing. You took other jobs during the summer. I remember my dad painted houses with a group of teachers. I wonder whether teachers' unions once served a good and useful purpose. Are they all bad now? Before we get to some more specific things, start, if you would, with the general, because I've spent most of my life, most of my career railing against teachers' unions, often for good reason, I think, but I just wonder whether there's another side.
Sure. There definitely was a time and a place for unions in our country. And I think this would be a good time to distinguish between public sector unions and private sector unions. They are very different entities. And when we're talking about teachers' unions, we're talking about public sector. Those are unions that represent state, local government workers, teachers in the public school system. Whereas in the private sector, we're talking about businesses, we're talking about industries, trades, sometimes the medical professions. So they're governed by different laws. And the public sector unions really, in many cases, are a more powerful entity in the state and at the local level. They have more power than the people, the taxpayers that are paying for the services that are provided by those government jobs. And the reason is that political nature. They basically, in essence, hire their own bosses. When they are at the negotiating table and they're sitting across from their boss, they help elect those people with their campaign contributions. They are very political. They fund a lot of political causes and candidates. So that's one way that the playing field is not even with regard to taxpayers and residents and the unions. And another way is that there's just no natural checks and balances on union power in the public sector like there is in the private sector. In the public sector,
sorry, go ahead.
In the public sector, we've even seen this in Illinois. Unions will argue that there's basically this never-ending pot of money because the government entity can always raise taxes to cover their demands. But that's not the case in the private sector. In the private sector, if a union demands more than what the business can afford, the business won't exist anymore. We actually saw that with the case of Hostess. I like to point out Hostess. That's why we didn't have Twinkies for a while, was because there was labor strife, there were strikes, and Hostess couldn't afford it anymore, and the company closed for a while. There are none of those natural checks and balances in the public sector with the unions.
Miley, you reminded me of a story as you were speaking. You know who Willie Brown is in California. He's a big, famous, notorious lefty, but a very honest fellow. And after he retired from elective politics, he wrote a newspaper column. He may write now. And he said in one of his columns, you know, when I was a young hotshot radical in Sacramento, we railed against the robber barons, the big businessmen, the big corporations that we felt were running everything. Now the public sector unions are doing exactly that, he said. They are the ones who strike fear in the hearts of legislators and others in Sacramento. I thought that was a very interesting admission.
It is, and it's very perceptive, and that is something that we see playing out in Illinois and in other states. Different states have different rules that govern. Illinois just happens to be one where there are very few restrictions on what government unions can do. One of the things that government unions can do here is walk out on strike. And that's another difference between the public sector and the private sector. In the public sector, when teachers or sanitation workers or other government services, when those people walk out, the taxpayers, the residents are stuck. There isn't another place where they can go and get those services. Whereas in the private sector, you know, if the store workers at your preferred grocery store go out on strike, or they negotiate a deal that ends up increasing prices for the consumer, you can go somewhere else. So basically the unions in the private sector or in the public sector have a monopoly over those services, and they use that power to get and meet more of their demands.
Well, Miley, I think some of us have views of the public interest, and then that old devil personal interest enters in. It's not necessarily wrong. You know, the wise man once said, if I'm not for myself. I'll ask you what I ask myself. If you were a teacher, would you want to belong to the union, or would you be a rebel and a holdout?
Well, I've been a rebel and a holdout my whole life, so I would probably be a rebel and a holdout. But what is very interesting is I have talked with hundreds of teachers, and what we tend to hear from the teachers themselves is that they like their local union. They like the people that at the local level go in and represent and bargain on their behalf. What they don't like is the hierarchy that comes along with it. And what many people don't realize is that if you're going to be a union member, if your teacher is a union member, he or she is not just a member of that local union, they also belong to the state and the national affiliates. And there are many teachers who would like to disable and get away from those state and national affiliates, but they like their local. And you can't, the way that the system is set up, teachers have to belong to all of the affiliates in order to belong to the local. I know in some states, there are places where there are local onlys. There are a few places around here in Illinois where the teachers unions have formed just a local unit and they have not affiliated, but with the broader spectrum of union affiliates. But typically what we see is teachers who don't like what those state and national unions are doing, but feel bound to stay in the union because they like their local.
Miley, here's a question I'm not entirely sure of, sure the answer to. I suppose I could talk out of both sides of my mouth on it. Should teachers have the right to strike?
That's a great question. And in many states, they do not have the right to strike, or if there is a right to strike, or if there's not a right to strike, there are very few repercussions if they do. And my answer to that, though, is no. Teachers and other government sector workers should not have a right to strike. for the very reason that I mentioned before. The people who rely on those government services are then left in the lurch. Parents are left without a place for their children to get an education when teachers go on strike. Other government entities are left without providing services that many people need when workers go on strike. In Illinois, I will say that peace officers and fire protection, they are not allowed to go on strike, and yet they still have the same collective bargaining rights and powers that other unions have, and it works well for them.
Miley, your audio went just a little bad for about the last 15 seconds. Maybe it'll heal itself.
Okay.
We'll be mindful of it. I just want to tell our audience that Molly and I were talking earlier today, and we remembered that it has long been said people in general dislike Congress, the US Congress. They disapprove of Congress, but they like their own congressman. And I think surveys have shown, Molly would know better than I, but I remember reading this, surveys have shown that people say, oh, the public schools are a mess, but our school is good. Do I have that? This was many years ago, this was said and reported. Is it still true, Miley?
I think it's definitely true of unions. People love their teachers. And it's okay, and we need to make sure that people know that it's okay to not like what the union. It's okay to disagree with the union and still support your teacher. And I think that what we are seeing through the experience of the pandemic and with teachers' unions being so entrenched against reopening schools in person and full time, we are beginning to see parents, especially, learning how this system is stacked against their children and beginning to see that they can support their teacher and not like what the union is doing.
Miley, sorry, your words are wonderful and your audio is lousy. And I'm no technologist. Maybe someone with our program is. I just don't want anyone to miss what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I've never had this problem before, so I'm just moving the computer and hoping maybe getting closer to it helps.
Yes. Great. Good. Let me throw this at you, Miley. Again, I was thinking this morning as I was anticipating our talk. Many years ago, my colleague Ramesh Ponnuru said something very arresting and blunt. He's kind of good at that. And I've quoted him many times since. He said, our schools will be better as soon as parents want them to be, and not a day before. And I think of that, a line from the King James Bible, and hard saying. That struck me as a hard saying, but probably true. What do you think of it?
I think that the system that has been created has left parents powerless. I think that while parents, and we're seeing different parent groups in Chicago especially, who are rising up and asking to have a voice. The problem is they are locked out of having a voice within the realm of labor and collective bargaining. They don't have a place at the table. When the Chicago Teachers Union was sitting across from Mayor Lori Lightfoot, negotiating over whether or not to reopen schools, there isn't a place there for the parents. The union is there to represent union interests only. They're only there to represent their members. And likewise, like Lori Lightfoot is there, arguably there to represent parents and children, but she has a lot of other interests that she is also trying to represent. If parents are going to take back some of this control, we're going to have to see reforms at the state level. I say at the state level as opposed to federal because teachers unions, government sector unions are controlled by state law. And we will have to see a repeal of some of these powers that unions have been given in order for parents to have a voice at the table.
Marta, forgive me if this is a dumb question. I'm a little out of touch, but when I was growing up, there were PTAs. Do they exist?
They do still exist. I'm a parent.
Are they quaint or are they sort of a real thing with influence?
I don't think that they have any influence over what happens at the negotiating table. In my experience, the PTA has influence over fundraising and providing money for various projects like playgrounds. I do live in a district and my children are in school where there is an active PTL or PTO in every school, but they're not a policy making organization. So they don't go in and talk with the administrators necessarily about this is the policy of the school and I do or don't like it. They're there more as a supplemental income for the school and to ensure that there are programs and different things available for students to enjoy.
Here's a really big question, Miley. I once asked it of Betsy DeVos. And I don't mean this in some dramatic, radical way. It's just sort of an honest, candidly stated question. Do you think the public school system should be broken up and that we should have more like a free market in schools? Betsy thinks essentially yes.
Well, what I think is that parents should have more choices, for sure. I happen to have 3 children, and I have 2 children in private school and 1 children in a public school because that is what was best for them. So I do think that parents should have more choices. If they want their kids in a public school and they feel that their public school is meeting their needs, then that's great. But if their public school is not meeting their needs, we do need to see things, school choice is not necessarily one of my areas of expertise, but I certainly have feelings about it. And we need to make sure that parents have choices and they're not just stuck with one system that's broken and definitely geared toward union interests as opposed to the students' interests.
Right. You remind me that some years ago, I was talking to an education expert, a conservative, and I think many people on my side of things think, public schools bad, charter schools great. And I remember this lady said to me, no, Jay, there are good public schools and bad public schools, and good charter schools and lousy charter schools. But maybe the good thing about charter schools is that the lousy ones are allowed to fail.
And the same thing private schools. There are good private schools and there are terrible private schools, and those terrible private schools are allowed to fail as well. There is no one propping them up and making sure that they continue to exist when they're failing to educate students.
Sometimes I hear public school teachers and public school administrators say something sort of plaintive, and I kind of buy it. And I wonder if you do too. They say, look, we're the last resort. We have to take everyone. We can't be choosy. It's really hard. It's easier to say, if we want you, and you, we're going to kick you out. We're kind of stuck here providing a public service. And when I hear that, I think, all right, there's a point.
If it were a teacher saying that to me, I would encourage them to look at what their union has gone on record supporting. Chicago Teachers Union, I point to Chicago Teachers Union, not just because it's in my backyard and it's been making news, but because Chicago Teachers Union prides itself, is on record for saying that they basically pave the way for other unions to follow. So that's why I continue to point to them. But Chicago Teachers Union has actually, the last 2 rounds of negotiations, bargained into their contract a moratorium on charter schools. Not just the number of charter schools, but the number of students that can utilize them. So it's the union itself that is diminishing and controlling what those options are to parents. Public schools don't have to be the last resort, but it's unions that are prohibiting the choices from being available to parents and allowing other schools to help educate students.
Mm. All right, let's get to this lockdown issue or closures and reopenings and so on. I'll just tell the audience, I was telling Miley earlier today, I'm in a strange position in this pandemic. Everyone hates the guy who's on both sides because we all have to pick a side and fight for our tribe. But I really understand the shutdown people, the lockdown people, the closure people, the public health concerns. I don't think they're bad people who want life to stop. I think they're doing their best to grope their way through a plague, a pandemic. And I understand the get on with life people. I understand them very well. I think I can see both sides. And Harry Truman famously said that he always wanted a one-handed economist because his guys were always telling him on one hand this, on the other hand this. But I do feel that way. I must say I do have some sympathy with both tribes. And I think they're good people on both sides. So with that said, and you know a lot more about this than I do, what do you say, Mailee Smith?
I think that could be the case for a lot of issues that government units have faced, but that isn't necessarily the case with the reopening of schools. When you look at the number of entities and organizations that support the reopening of schools, it vastly outweighs the number of entities that have been against it. Really, the only entities that have been against reopening are the teachers' unions. Now, they couch it in terms of saying, well, we only want to open when it's safe, but when you dig into what their demands are, it's not about safety. It's about things like Chicago Teachers Union was demanding things like defunding the police and having the district take a stance on rent abatement. So it wasn't about safety. But on the other hand, you have the American Academy of Pediatrics, you have the CDC, you have study upon study from here in the United States and abroad. You have UNICEF. I mean, even the UN has taken a stance on reopening, and it's really quite drastic when you think about it. I can't think of any other issue where you have all of these entities lining up, basically saying the same thing. We have to get kids back in school. And the only ones on the other side are the teachers' unions who are slowing down the process.
Do you think there's any risk to teachers in returning, or is it an acceptable risk? You know what I mean by that?
We definitely want to make sure that teachers are safe. But it's been very interesting to watch not only the studies, like I mentioned, but just the anecdotal data that we're seeing in Chicago and around the state from schools that have opened. In Chicago, there are parochial schools that have opened. There have been no significant outbreaks. Downstate Illinois, many schools actually started full-time at the beginning of the school year back in August with students in the schools, and there have been no significant outbreaks. So we want to make sure that the teachers are safe, but the data is showing, and schools around the country are showing, that this can be done safely and protect both students and teachers.
Mailee, do you have reforms you recommend, legal and otherwise? In other words, I think it was Lenin who said, what is to be done? If you were czar, so, Governor Smith or just some sort of capo of the state, and you could just wave your wand or wield your scepter, what would you do?
First of all, I think I would pull back on the right to strike. I would say with teachers unions, there are two things that stand out. It's that ability to go out on strike, and it is the vast number of issues that they can bargain over. So we want to make sure that students stay in school and that students are not used as a pawn in a political game between a public sector union and a mayor or a school board. So not only prohibiting strikes in the government sector, but making sure those prohibitions have teeth. Chicago Teachers Union has engaged in an illegal strike before. Had they gone out on strike this year, it would have been an illegal strike, but there aren't really any repercussions that, they can be fined. But just last year, the CTU brought in $33.9 million. So fines aren't really all that big of a deal. So we would want to see prohibitions on strikes with some sort of teeth to it as well. And the other thing that I mentioned is the vast number of subjects that teachers can, in unions in general, in the public sector can negotiate over. It's not just that they're negotiating over wages and benefits. They negotiate over virtually anything, especially in Illinois. And the more subjects that there are to negotiate over, the harder it is for a government unit to function, the more costly it becomes. And if you do have a strike ability in place, that means there's more issues over which to go on strike. So what I would like to see is pulling back on, on the subjects that go into the collective bargaining agreement, limit it to wages, raises, those sort of things that are financial and benefits, and not get into the day-to-day, like when does the school day start? When does the school day end? When do buses arrive? Because all of those sorts of things bog down the process.
Miley, just out of curiosity, who should make those decisions, beginning of day, end of day?
Well, I think that the school administrators should be making those decisions. I think I've got a great example of how this bogs down a process. There is a suburb in Illinois, Palatine, where the students, many of the students were at, or they were low income. They had never had busing in the school district. And this was just a few years ago. The school district was going to implement busing for the first time. But in order to ensure that students got to school in a timely manner and to keep the costs down so that they weren't like paying for multiple buses, they wanted to adjust the timeline of the day. But because that was something that had to be negotiated, the teachers union actually stood in the way, and they were not able to do busing in the most efficient manner. They had to do it in a different way and push it back a little bit to appease the teachers union. So that's a great example of, that should be something that the administrator should be able to say, you know what, we're going to stagger our start times so that we can bus children who are low income to the school and make it easier on parents. But they weren't able to do that because they had to negotiate over it.
Well, Miley, I think I'm about at the end of my time, and we're going to turn the show, so to speak, over to audience questions. But before I go, is there some glaring, obvious question I've overlooked, something you want to say that I should have brought up?
I think we covered most of it, and I know we covered what we talked about. So I don't think so. I'm curious to see what the audience has to ask.
Well, we'll find out. So, Chris, hello, and I will say goodbye. And Miley, what a pleasure to speak with you, and keep it up. And thanks so much.
Thank you.
So long.
Hey, Mailee, thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions coming in, which, Mailee, we're going to let you field. Some of you hinted to a little bit, but maybe you can answer some of them specifically. I'm going to roll through them. First, what impact do you think the COVID lockdowns will have on unions going forward?
That's a great question. And I think, like so many things with COVID, some of this remains to be seen. But I do think that this is an opportune time for, in this context, parents to start demanding reforms. Like I mentioned, this is the first time that I think parents have really seen the amount of control that teachers unions have over their kids and over their school district, their education. So I think that if there's a silver lining to the pandemic, it's that people are more aware. And we see that the perception of unions is changing. We have been doing some polls, and one just related to CTU. We've seen that as of last month, there was only a 19.1% favorability toward CTU. I'm sorry, that's this month, 19.1. It actually has gone down since last month. Only 40%. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting some of this mixed up because I just pulled these numbers this morning, but we're seeing that the favorability is decreasing toward the union, and people are becoming more aware, like I mentioned, that it's okay to support my teacher. I love my kids' teachers, but it's okay for me to love the teachers and not agree with what the union is doing.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. I'm very curious what the staying power of that will be once kids are back in school.
Very, very true, yes.
Next question, with Speaker Madigan deposed, will the teachers unions in Illinois become more powerful or less powerful?
That is an excellent question. I think for now, we're going to see a status quo. In Illinois, the unions are involved in everything. It's really quite astounding when you can look at what bills unions have slipped for or against. That means made a public endorsement for or against, and they're involved in virtually everything. And it's hard to get a bill passed in Illinois if the union stands against it. We did some research last year of the sitting lawmakers. Last year, every single Democrat lawmaker in the state of Illinois at that time, last August, had taken money from a union. Now, there are a number of Republicans who have as well, but that just demonstrates how entrenched the unions are in Illinois when they have given money to every single Democrat sitting in the General Assembly.
Very good. This question I just have to ask because I love it. I actually asked this question of Corey DeAngelis on a different call last week. Mark Janis asks, what effect will the Janis decision have over teachers' unions? Thanks, Mark, for your question.
Mark, I'll provide a little bit of background. The Janis versus AFSCME decision was initiated. That case started in Illinois with plaintiff Mark Janis. Mark was a public sector worker here for the state of Illinois, and he rightfully argued that it was not fair that he was having to pay a union. He wasn't a member, but he still had to pay fees to the union. And he argued successfully up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that it is unconstitutional to force government workers to pay fees to a union just to keep their job. So the effect that has had in Illinois, we have seen thousands of teachers stop paying dues or fees to their union. What it means for teachers is that if they are still a member of their union, they can leave their union, they can stop paying dues, and they keep all of the benefits. Remember, those benefits that they get are provided by the employer. Their raises, it's in the contract with the union, but the employer cannot treat them any differently. So they're guaranteed all of those benefits. So they can leave the union and keep their benefits and stop paying dues to a union with which they disagree.
Just a follow-up question on that. Will any of that be impacted by some of the recent legislation in the stimulus bill?
So I'm not sure about the stimulus bill, but the PRO Act just passed the House.
That's the one. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. And so that's a great question, because it's another reminder that there is a difference between public sector and private sector unions. Technically, the PRO Act and whatever the federal government does, they can only change the law with regard to private sector unions. So it doesn't touch the power that unions in the public sector have been given in Illinois or Wisconsin or Michigan. Those unions will have the same power this year that they did last year, regardless of what happens with the PRO Act.
Very good. A couple of questions around the similar theme. How much responsibility do unions bear for the woke effects in curricula or teaching methods?
Well, I can give some anecdotal examples for that. Recently, there was a curriculum mandate. Well, it's a curriculum teaching standards mandate that was passed down by the Department of Education here and allowed to go into effect by a committee called JCAR. And it involved some of those, many criticized it because it was forcing training on progressive type issues. And I will say that the teachers union, the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and I can't remember if they both did, but there's Illinois Federation of Teachers and the Illinois Education Association. One of them had on their website front and center encouraging their teacher members to let that committee know they wanted that curriculum, that mandate passed. So we do see the unions typically supporting the legislation or rules or mandates that come down that have to do with those sort of either social issues or curriculum issues that many people are opposed to.
Lori asks a very good question, which you just hinted on with the difference between public and private sector unions. In the public sector union, essentially the taxpayer is the employer. We're holding the bag for whatever the benefits are. So she asks, is there any plan to address public sector pension reform? The union, of course, will be opposed to that on behalf of their members, as will the politicians. But according to all financial sectors, without pension reform, the state will never recover. So can you talk a little bit about pension reform?
Sure. Pension reform. Pension is the number one public policy problem that we have in Illinois today. And one of the biggest hindrances to addressing the problem is the unions, is the public sector unions. Unfortunately, in Illinois, what it will take to pass any sort of reform is an amendment. And it is something that we have been especially engaged on. And you can read more about our public sector and our pension work on our website, which is illinoispolicy.org. My colleague Adam Schuster has written quite a bit about the pension problem and what we need to do in the state of Illinois to address it.
Sandy asks a question, and I'm not familiar with it, so you can in Illinois probably speak to this, but can you comment on the recent passage of the Education Act passed by the legislature in Illinois?
So I haven't really looked into that much. I will say that it gets more into education than it does labor, but we will probably be looking at that. And if it has some bearing on labor, we'll be talking about it on our website.
Okay. Robert asks, if parents' only recourse is to make changes at the state level through legislative changes, won't they be stymied by union influence on the legislature?
That's true, but I will also say that your representative and your senator answer to you, and they want to be reelected. And if parents are banding together and ensuring that representative or senator is not reelected, they're going to listen to parents. That they'd rather be elected than get $5,000 from the union or something like that. So it's not a worthless objective. It's something that lawmakers need to hear from their constituents. Otherwise, they just assume that the union is speaking on behalf of the parents. So we need to make sure that lawmakers know that we don't agree with what the union is doing and that we will vote against them if they continue to do what the union wants as opposed to what their constituents want.
Mailee, this might be a little bit redundant from some of the things you and Jay had already discussed, but I think it's good to focus on. The question is, it seems like the liberal establishment is being forced to challenge teachers' unions, probably in effect, some of the COVID lockdowns. Do you think those will create an opportunity for reform even in blue states?
I definitely think it is an opportunity for reform. Like I mentioned the polling where we're seeing that people have a negative perception of the Chicago Teachers Union and how over the last month that has continued to, that those who have a negative opinion, those numbers are increasing. And so I think what it is up to us to make sure is that we continue to talk about it. You had referred to, whether or not this will still be the case once kids are back in school. We need to continue to talk about it. It's not just a pandemic. It's not just about reopening schools. There are so many decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis that are affected by the union and not necessarily what the district wants, that we don't even think about. So this has, I think, opened people's eyes, and we need to make use of this time to ensure that eyes aren't closed again, that we continue to let people know that they need to be talking about this and making a difference in their school districts and in their own districts, so that the unions are not trampling on their rights.
All right, this may be our last question, and it hits on a few of the themes we've talked about: collective bargaining, pension reform, unions. And I hope it's not our last one because I don't want to leave on a dour note, but Craig asks, how is there any hope to reform public sector pensions, collective bargaining, school choice, and the like, when the Democratic Party has such a stranglehold on the city of Chicago and the Illinois state government?
That's a fantastic question. And it's something that it's not just related to labor. It is related to pensions. It's related to budget. It's related to tax, because the unions touch all of those things. But I know I mentioned the silver lining before. We are seeing, and more people are seeing, the effects that now that it's affecting people's daily lives, they've taken notice. It's been affecting our daily lives for years and for decades, but it hasn't touched us personally, necessarily as parents, until recently. And now that it has, hope that we can capitalize on the momentum that is being created by the negative perception that the unions have created for themselves, so that we make that, environment toxic for them. That if you're talking with your lawmaker and your lawmaker sided with the union as opposed to with what his constituents want, we want it to get to the point where that lawmaker doesn't want to admit that he did what the union wanted and not what his constituents wanted.
Very good. That actually takes us to the end of our questions. I think we've addressed all of them. As I'm looking at our attendee list, I see some familiar names from all across the country. So while we focused quite a bit today on the state of Illinois, I think a lot of the issues they discussed, Miley, are applicable to other states as well.
Definitely.
So I appreciate the wide-ranging discussion. I'm actually going to have one more question from our friend Peter Denton. I'm going to see if I can figure out how quickly to let him speak. No, I don't. Looks like I have the technical capability to do that. So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Miley, for your time. We appreciate everything you're doing and appreciate everything Illinois Policy Institute is doing. And we will look forward to doing something with you all in person very soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.